Good afternoon. This is week 4 of the 4 talks set on Adolf Hitler, and this one is about this one is about a program called T4 or Tiergartenstrasse 4. This was the program of organized medical killing. I intentionally was not going to get into the final solution to any great degree here. That's done quite a bit, but T4 is not, and this actually helps to form the blueprint of what you're going to call the final solution, or what it was known in German as Endlösung. This program here was an attempt to Aryanize the German race. It's virtually what this is, by eliminating, if you want to use the term, as they did, mental incompetence or mental defectives, incurably physically handicapped, and even to the extent, and as the program metastasizes here, people afflicted with inferior genes. Note the terms. And of course, this was going with the larger agenda of another term that comes out here, racial hygiene. Yeah, you like the terms that they use to explain this. And this is really, for want of a better description, not in its entirety, but eugenics out of control. Now, the idea of eugenics had long been in fashion at this point, coming out of the 19th into the 20th century, where people were looking to, keep in mind here, the society is becoming more sophisticated. The Industrial Revolution, technology, capitalism, the world's changing here. Societies are becoming more sophisticated, more integrated in some fashion, but the industrial influence here is not to be questioned. It can't be questioned. And so the industrialization helps to, if you want to use the term, maybe not totally kill extended families, but it does have an impact on extended families. And you get more the nuclear family because of the fact many people now, sons and daughters, especially sons, maybe are no longer carrying on the father's tradition of being a cobbler, being a farmer, being this, being that. With the growth of factories, how about department stores, technology? Now there are other interests, and people are beginning to move away here. And so what happened to the extended family? It's dying here. Except for, of course, maybe if you go to Pennsylvania Dutch, you go to the Amish. No, they seem to survive this. But you're seeing maybe one method of fracturing the society. Well, as people are growing here, keep in mind, too, with the advent of machinery, industrialization of farming, what's happening? More food? What does more food mean? More people? Yeah. And so now there's a growth in the idea that perhaps we need to curb, if you will, the propagation of certain people. And what is it that Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said? 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. That was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And even in the United States, this idea was really beginning to gain traction in this country. Sterilization, that's where I'm going here. Sterilization. And books like Madison Grant, who wrote a book called The Passing of the Race. He was a noted racist of his day, late 19th into the 20th century. And it's suggested here by some historians that Madison Grant's ideas of controlling the population or curbing certain elements of the population to perpetuate maybe a section of the population that's more advantageous to the primacy of the country, that helped set the stage for the 1922 Johnson Act and the following legislation of 1924, limiting immigrants from certain areas of Europe. yeah, it's okay for Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, Germans, French, and British to come here, but maybe we don't want as many Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and people from Eastern Europe coming here. And it's suggested by some today that the current administration has based their immigration/racial policy on what occurred in 1922, 1924. I mean, keep in mind too, go back to that period post 1919, 18, 1919, what you call the First World War, the Red Scare. There were people who didn't want folks coming in here from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. Number one, maybe some of them are Catholic, God forbid. Or the Red Scare, we don't want socialists coming here, God forbid. And so interesting here, and I have a book here, and it's an interesting book. It's called The Nazi Connection, Eugenics, American Racism, and German National Socialism. Interesting here on page 15. American eugenicists enjoyed a strong standing among their foreign colleagues. European eugenicists admired the success of their American counterparts. In fact, Nazi doctors will use this sort of argument in their defense at Nuremberg, the United States. The German racial hygiene movement followed the development of the American eugenics movement closely. During World War I, the Society for Racial Hygiene in Berlin distributed a public flyer extolling, and this is in quotes, the dedication with which Americans sponsor research in the field of racial hygiene, with which they translate theoretical knowledge into practice. The flyer referred to a donation of several $1 million by the widow of a railway magnate in support of the eugenics laboratory in Cold Spring Harbor. Also mentioned was a foundation established in 1915 following a eugenics conference in Battle Creek, Michigan, which provided $300,000 for conferences and exhibitions in the field of eugenics. According to the flyer, this financial support facilitated intensive research in the field of heredity, including Alexander Graham Bell's extensive studies on longevity. Interesting here where this is going. And so in 1909, states begin to pass sterilization laws in this country. California, Illinois, Indiana, Virginia, but guess who's one of the first? Yeah, Connecticut, that's right, Connecticut. And in fact, supposedly the state sterilized at least 600 people, 600 and change by the early 1960s. I remember I was giving this talk at another place, and I said, God bless you, I said the early 1960s, and this lady in the back put her hand up. And she said that she was a nurse at Stanford Hospital. And this is 1965, 1966, 1967. And she said she personally witnessed poor black women at Stanford Hospital being sterilized. Now, I don't know the legal ramifications as to those cases. I can't speak to that. I'm just telling you what she said she saw here as a nurse at Stanford Hospital. And she said they were all black. They weren't white, they were all black. And so sterilization in this country, yes, was for people considered mentally defective, perhaps some incurably physically handicapped. How about career criminals, people like this? If you recall the character played by Montgomery Clift in the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, which I thought he hit a home run there with that character. But that does give you an idea. And yes, the Nazis are going to pick up on this because of the fact, and interesting here, and this is Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler. In general, it should not be forgotten that the highest aim of human existence is not the preservation of a state, let alone a government, but the preservation of the species. That's Hitler. Only through the recognition of this principle have wars of liberation against internal and external enslavement of nations on the earth come down to us in such majestic historical examples. Human law cancels out state law. And if a people is defeated, now note the premise of this. And if a people is defeated in its struggle for human rights, this merely means that it has been found too light in the scale of destiny for the happiness of survival on this earth. For when a people is not willing or able to fight for its existence, I'll get a load of this one. Providence in its eternal justice has decreed that people's end. Wow. And he ends this passage by saying, the world is not for cowardly peoples. Wow. Yeah. Now, when you go back to this period, the eugenics movement, you had racists here like Madison Grant, people like this. But you also had people like Margaret Sanger. Planned Parenthood later on? Yeah, she was into eugenics, but from the position of education. She's later going to lambaste the Nazis because the Nazis are going to pollute the waters of the eugenics movement. She was one of those that stated that unless women have control of their own bodies, they will never be the political equals of men. Because she said women should have an equal say with their husband as to how many kids they're going to have. That was Margaret Sanger. And so when the extreme right blames her for abortion, let's understand something. Planned Parenthood didn't implement abortion until 4 years after she died. Now let's get the chronology right here. Let's get the chronology right. And so, interestingly enough, and another one who likened to that agenda here was Helen Keller. Helen Keller was a big one here, yes, in planning a population, but let's do it from a position of education here. She was firmly convinced that some women like herself, who are maybe blind or who are deaf or both, part of this was the result of working conditions in factories. Lack of proper food, lack of hygiene, lack of proper medical care. That's what she likened some of this to. Interesting, when they talk about Helen Keller, many people who do, or many people who write about her, seem to conveniently leave out the fact that at one point she was an ardent socialist. I gathered some of her writings. They're interesting to read as a socialist. She was a supporter of Lenin's revolution in 1917. Anti-capitalist, pro-worker. Anti-war. Interesting people coming up here. But yes, the Nazis are going to resort to sterilization. Starting really in 1933, going into 1934. And they are going to, and the idea again is to Aryanize the German race. If we're going to have a virile race, what do we need useless eaters for? Again, here's that terminology. What do we need useless eaters for? There is a man, I think his last name is Weiss. He wrote a good book. The book's about this thick, though. It's called The Ideology of Death. And he gets into this about, racial hygiene. In fact, there is a book written by a doctor called Racial Hygiene. It's about the Nazi doctors. It's fascinating read. These are fascinating reads. It's an aspect of the Nazi era that do not seem to gain the traction. But they're very important because it's an underpinning here of where the Nazis are going to go. And so sterilization will be used to strengthen the race. At the same time, they're galvanizing Germanics, and I went into this when I talked about the SS, you know, trying to get German, again, racial hygiene, trying to, if you want to include this, trying to get German women to produce more than one child at a clip, to propagate the German population for the 1,000-year Reich, even down to the point where Himmler thought they ought to eat porridge because that was emblematic of why Scotch people are a virile race, porridge. The only thing these women got was fat. You know, it makes you wonder where they got the scientific background for that. But yes, as you get to the late 30s, and they're sterilizing a lot of people here. They're sterilizing a lot of people. You know, when you're ordered to report to the doctor, you report. It's that simple. But in 1938, a man by the name of Nauer, writes the Reich Chancellery. And he has a little girl, a daughter, who was born missing a leg, part of an arm, and was blind. And he wants her aborted. So he writes the Reich Chancellery. And Dr. Victor Brandt is the one who gets to see this letter at the Reich Chancellery. He's Hitler's doctor. And he communicates this to the Fuhrer, and Hitler says, go see this child up at Leipzig. And so he goes to Leipzig. He sees the child, and the child is as the father says. And having said that, he gives the doctors the permission to perform the Nodentag, or mercy death of the child, which will be done. And so the Nauer child is that beginning of the children's program. And the Nazis will implement this. All children aged fetus to age 3. Well, you know, when you go to the doctor or hospital, whatever the case may be, don't you have to fill out a medical form, which might be 2-3 pages, although maybe today it's 10 pages, the way bureaucrats are today. And, you know, there are certain sections which have to be filled out here as to any detriments the child's born with. And so if the child is to be terminated from a fetus to age 3 because the child is considered, defective here, they use either a lethal injection of morphine scopolamine, or they ground up luminol and put it in the child's food, and the child is terminated. And a letter of condolence is sent to the family, and the body is interred, or later on they're gonna put him in an oven. That's coming too. And so, you know, using lethal injection. However, you know, they get the bright idea here. Well, why don't we expand this program? And Hitler okays it now from fetus to age 3. Now we're going to broaden it to age 16. See what's happening here? You know, once they've started this. And they're even including here, they broaden the reasons, the rationale for this. Things like Mongolism. How about borderline juvenile delinquency? How do you like that one? Well, who determines that? And so children, again, these youngsters are being terminated by lethal injection. Now, you know, as the program expands, then they're going to get the bug here. You know, well, instead of fetus to age 3, instead of to age 16, how about expanding it for the entire population, the adults included? And so that's what Hitler wants to do. This is 1939. Just, you know, it's the war has virtually started at this point. September 1, 1939, the Germans crossed the Polish border. And so he contacts Dr. Leonardo Conti, who was also an SS officer, and Victor Brack from the Reich Chancellery. And he tells them he wants to broaden the program. Well, Dr. Leonardo Conti wants a written authorization for this. And Hitler's not ready to do that. And so Victor Brack and oh, what's his name here? Now his name just left me. Hans Lammers, who runs the Reich Chancellery. Victor Brack and Hans Lammers do not need written authorization. If Hitler says, let's do it, let's do it. What do we need a written authorization for? The Fuhrer has said, let's do it. And so Hitler will finally write a written authorization. This is in October of 1939. Now note how he does this. He backdates the authorization to September 1. This is like a month and a half later. He backdates this to October 1, to September 1. Why did he do that? He wants this put forth as a war measure. A war measure. We're invading Poland September 1. Let's have this as a war measure. And he does not put it on Reich Chancellery stationery. He puts it on his personal stationery. That's what he does. And interesting how Hitler is thinking of this politically. Interesting. And so they begin to form this program out of the Reich Chancellery. Hans Lammers and Victor Brack. And this will be called Department 2. And interesting here too, what they're going to really call this program. I mean, you know, the names they come up with here. Get this, the cover name, like Reich Department 2, but the cover name is Reich Work Group of Sanatoriums and Nursing Homes. That's what they call this. And now begins the administrative fiction for this. And as you know, people go to the doctor or the hospital, right? You have to fill out these forms. And on these forms, you know, not only your doctor's name, your medical history perhaps, where you live, so on and so forth. There will be 4 categories that eventually have to be filled in, either by you or your doctor or the attending physician. 4 categories. 1, do you have such debilitations as schizophrenia, epilepsy, senility, retardation, encephalitis, and therapy-resisting paralysis? 2nd category, or are you criminally insane? 3rd, a 5-year history of institutionalization. Or 4, and here we go, because this is part of the broadening of this program, a lack of German citizenship or blood. That is, Jewish people, Gypsies, Slavs, Negroes, whatever the case may be. In other words, another terminology here. Those afflicted with inferior genes. How do you like that terminology? Inferior genes. And so each candidate, each person that has filled these out, a psychiatrist will, a panel of 3 psychiatrists will go over these forms. If they find, get this, and when I wrote this, I found this astounding when I was doing the research on this. Each questionnaire was reviewed by a panel of 3 medical experts, usually psychiatrists. Upon completion of his review, each panelist would mark the space provided on the lower left-hand corner with a red plus for death, or a blue dash for life, and the 3rd option, a question mark for further review. Now, those 3 who reviewed this case, that case is then kicked upstairs to a master reviewer who will read this thing, hopefully read it, and either concur with the ruling of the three panelists, or not concur, but that master reviewer has the final say to concur or overrule the panel. And there's a doctor by the name of Hermann Fanmuller, who will go on trial at Nuremberg. Dr. Hermann Fanmuller. And interesting here, in a 17-day period, this shows you how the program has expanded. Again, recall, fetus to age 3, then to age 16, now the general population. Where do you think the workload's going? North. And so in a 17-day period, this Dr. Hermann Fanmuller, as a master reviewer, went over 2,109 cases in 17 days. Now, do you honestly think Dr. Hermann Fanmuller was reading each and every one of these questionnaires before he made a decision? He has other duties, doesn't he? Sure he does. You honestly think he read 2,109 cases in 17 days? There aren't 48 hours in a day, folks. There's not 8 days a week. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So what do you think is happening? People falling through the cracks. People falling through the cracks. Now, once these people have been judged for termination, now we have another element of this. I mean, keep in mind here, they will draw up transportation schedules. And in these transportation schedules, ambulances, if you want to use that term, will be used to transfer people from the hospital they're at to another hospital, which is really a transfer station. And these ambulances are white, but the windows are blackened off, so you can't see inside. And the personnel manning these ambulances, for the most part, SS in white uniforms. You know, like medical attendants or doctors, right? Or nurses, whatever the case may be. And they are furnished with paperwork to get that ambulance through any roadblock they might chance upon. This is known, and again, here's the terminology, the Common Welfare Ambulance Service. Note these names here. And so they will take this person or this candidate from the hospital or doctor's office they're at to the next leg of the journey here. A hospital or a transit post is really what it is. And a letter is sent to the family about their loved one. Your loved one has been sent to a different hospital for alternative therapy. And this goes back to Hitler post-dating his order to September 1. Since we are at war, facilities and fuel are not available to take you to the next hospital. See what he's doing here? It's a war measure. The Army, Air Force, and Navy have primacy with regards to fuel, so on and so forth. And so from this transfer point, the second hospital, they will be sent to a killing center, of which there are 6, yes. And so there are 6 killing centers: Bernburg, Brandenburg, Sonnenheim, Hartheim, Hadamar. Hadamar, you'll hear that one later on. But all these killing centers at one point had been hospitals, except for Brandenburg. That had at one point been a prison. And so they will build walls. Of course, Brandenburg already had walls. It had been a prison. But they will build walls around these facilities to keep out viewing. And it is here that these people are terminated. Lethal injection. Morphine, scopolamine, curare, and prussic acid. Translation, cyanide. And however, it's at Brandenburg. You know, a man by the name of Christian Worth W-I-R-T-H. That's how he spells his last name. He is one of those that is working on the new idea. You know, they can't keep up with the new workload here with lethal injection. It's too slow. So anyone want to take a guess as to what the next step will be? Right, gas chamber. And so in Brandenburg, they convert a room, you know, with the shower head, bogus shower head, so on and so forth. And they're going to test this on some mentally retarded men. Now, some reports say there were 2, some there were 4. But Victor Brack and Victor Brandt go to watch this demonstration. And there is supposedly how they did this, where there was an engine outside the room with pipes leading from the engine into the, you know, carbon monoxide gas. And they pumped the gas in, and within 20, 30 minutes, these fellows are dead. And so what they do from there is they are put on stretchers. These stretchers are mechanical. They go down to the cellar below and into a crematorium where the bodies are burned. And wow, this will work. This will work. Now, these gas chambers are not huge. Depending on the facility, 15, 20, 25. Now, that's, you know, that's disgusting, but by later standards, that's extremely modest, especially like when Auschwitz-Birkenau, the gas chambers there could hold upwards of 2,000 at a time. And so the other killing facilities are installed with same. Now they're able to keep up with the workload. However, some people are beginning to question the letters of condolences. You know, the more people that are getting these letters, you don't think someone out of the plethora of people getting these letters aren't going to complain or aren't going to question them? Complain, at least question these things? Yeah, they are. They are. And also, it's beginning to be recognized, these buses from the Common Welfare Ambulance Service. Hadamar, this came out in Nuremberg. Hadamar was a case in point where kids playing in the street, 10, 12 years old, you know, noticing the ambulance going by, you know, if you don't behave, you'll wind up in the murder box going to Hadamar. The kids. And on top of that, as they are we'll call it processing the bodies with these crematoriums, what do you think's coming out of the chimneys here? Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then come the church. You know, the churches. A number of churches now are beginning now to question what the Nazis are doing. And I bring up a few here in particular. A bishop, Theophil Wurm of Württemberg, wrote letters of protest to Reich Minister Wilhelm Frick and Franz Gertner at the Reich Ministry of Justice. Pastor Paul Gerard Brunner and Pastor Friedrich von Bodelschwing, director of the Bethel Hospital, wrote or spoke to influential Nazis. One of Brunner's letters even wound up on Hitler's desk, while Cardinal Michael Vollhaber of Munich caused a stir when one of his letters wound up in Sweden. Now, people outside Germany are going to begin to know about this. Catholic Cardinal Adolf Bertram and Bishop Heinrich Weinken of the Fulda Conference of Bishops wrote letters of protest. And in the case of Bishop Weinken, even discussed the ceasing of this program with Dr. Victor Brack himself, but to no avail. However, the most powerful opposition came from a Bishop Count von Galen of Munster. Galen was a family renowned in Germany and the German states for centuries. And he gave a sermon, I think it was August 5th, 1941, denouncing the Nazis for this program. And this speech actually shook the foundations of the Reich Chancellery. This speech was smuggled out of Germany. Hundreds of thousands of copies were reprinted and dropped one night from RAF bombers on Germany. Leaflet raid. And Hitler was stung to fury. He wanted this guy shot. Goering agreed. Well, you don't think Goering's not going to agree here. Himmler, Martin Bormann, Robert Ley, the ardent radical Nazis. One man disagreed and voiced his opinion. A man who was thinking here, Joseph Goebbels. He disagreed. And the reason for his disagreement? He says, remember, we've invaded the Soviet Union and we need Catholic support against the communists. Yeah, sneaky. That's how Goering was thinking. Hitler relented. Okay, but when the war is over with, he gets his. But at this time, it's too late for the program. Hitler actually cancels it. Now let's understand something here. This was a collusion of the German medical community, party hacks, and the SS. And at this point, the German medical community is going to be overtaken here, and the program itself won't be known as T4 anymore. The program itself will now, the organized medical killing is over with. It now metastasizes into Endlösung, or the final solution. If we can get rid of mental defectives, incurably physically handicapped and related, then perhaps we can put an end, because we can't get rid of the Jewish people in Europe here. The idea of sending Jewish people to Madagascar, that's not going to happen. The British control the seas. How are we going to get them there? How are we going to get them there? And so as the Nazis begin to develop Eastern Europe, and I believe I mentioned this with the SS, they are going to redo the map in the East. Part of this is an area known as the government general. Poland is no longer ceases to exist. And the Germans the Nazis already had a plethora of concentration camps. Dachau, Theresienstadt, Ravensbrück, so on and so, Buchenwald, the one that really became popular here. But the death camps themselves, the real death camps, were in the East. Poland, Treblinka, Sobibor. How about Auschwitz-Birkenau, considered the poster child expression here? And so the idea here now is we're not going with the medical program. That's over with. Now understand this too. Most of the people terminated in this program, and estimates ranged anywhere from 70 to 75,000 up to 100,000 before this was over with. They were terminating, for the most part, Christians. If you're going to Aryanize the race, you're going to kill your own, right? Survival of the fittest. That's what this is, survival of the fittest. Now, instead of just terminating the weak in our own species or our own race, let's move on to Jewish people, Slavs, Gypsies, so on and so forth. And you begin to see this on the Eastern Front before the death camp system is really in place. I mean, Auschwitz started in 1941. But, the Einsatzgruppen, where they're actually shooting many Jewish people they capture on the Eastern Front and dumping them in the pits. I mean, Russia is so full of pits. They're going to be finding pits long after we are gone. And not just from this. How about during the Russian Civil War? The Reds versus the Whites. Russia is full of pits. And so it's estimated that the Einsatzgruppen exterminated anywhere from 1 million to 1.5 million by the middle of 1942. And as I mentioned before, many of these shooters, the Totenkopf, death's head, many of these guys wound up with alcohol and drug abuse issues. But Auschwitz was this idea coming out of the medical program to a refined, more sophisticated version, where the Nazis are going to use the Industrial Revolution, technology, and capitalism for this purpose. And it's estimated here that Rudolf Höss, who will be tried at Nuremberg and executed, and he writes his memoirs here and it was sold in the 1950s on the book stand. I have a copy of it at home. The Commandant at Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, who viewed this as like a 9-to-5 job as the commandant. You go to the office, go to work, and come home and tend the garden, be with his wife, play with the kids, whatever the case may be. It's a 9-to-5 job. And he was responsible for upwards of 2.5 million being exterminated. That's what this system produced. And so you go from a program of sterilization to T4 and then lethal injection, which again proved inadequate to keep up with the workload. Understand that concept. Keep up with the workload. And there was never a shortage of doctors or nurses to volunteer for or be put into this program. Never a shortage. Never a shortage. Wow. This is an essence of the Nazi state. Again, what did Hitler say? Preservation of the species, not Hegel, the German philosopher. The state is here. Preservation of the state, the individual is here. That's not Hitler. We're going beyond preservation of the state, preservation of the species. And so whenever you hear some of these groups today lambasting blacks, Latinos, Muslims, remember what happened in Nazi Germany. Remember what happened here. It can happen anywhere. Nobody is immune to this. Nobody is immune. But many of these doctors who perpetuated these crimes will use the United States in their defense. Sterilization. Oh, well, in fact, didn't that come out in that movie, Justice at Nuremberg? Yeah, the United States. The United States. In fact, it's estimated that between in 1909, 1910, by the early 1960s, some 60,000 people had been sterilized in this country. Yeah. And, that's nothing to be boastful about, I guess. But every country has its racists, or those who want to control, note the term control, the population. And that's what you saw here in Nazi Germany. This program, T4, ballooned into the final solution. But of course, when people talk about this end of the Third Reich, it's always the final solution that's really discussed, but not what really formed the blueprint here. But if you want to get down to separating who's processed first, the Nazis really work on Christians first, and then broaden this program to those afflicted with, and again the terminology, inferior genes. Of course, this gets you into people like Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, people like this. When the Israelis picked up Eichmann, remember that in 1960? And he was put on trial in Israel in that glass, yeah, remember that? Yeah. They were supposed to get Mengele at the same time, but he got tipped off and beat feet, got away. They never did catch him. But you know what else? He used to go back to Germany periodically. His family was the same family, if you're familiar with this, his family was the one that owned the Mengele Tool Company, so these people were not on the breadline. And so, yeah, but he made it to South America, but he will never be captured by the Israelis. He'll die down there. He'll die down there. And I think Mengele was one of those examples that Ira Levin will use to write the movie, and then you'll later see the movie, The Boys from Brazil. Remember that with Gregory Peck, who was very good as that demented Nazi doctor. Wow. Jeez. And you know, this leads to another, not Nazi Germany, the Japanese. How many here have ever heard of Unit 731? Ever hear of that? Unit 731? There's not many books written on it. You have to really look. You have to look to find this. This was a facility, let's put it that way, in Manchuria. And the Japanese, Colonel Ichiki, ran this facility. And it was staffed, and again, here we go with these doctors. And but for the most part, their test platforms, many of them were Chinese and Koreans, but some British, Australian, New Zealand, Dutch, and Americans wound up here. And they were practicing on these people on dissection, on exposing them to things like smallpox, brucellosis, so on and so forth, these different diseases, to see what the effects were while these guys were alive. And when the war is over with, nobody will be prosecuted. Nobody. The doctors that perform these horrendous feats of medical, this disgusting array of medicine, will go on for long private practices, whether they had private practice or will ever be brought up on charges. And Colonel Ichiki got a free pass. Why? The United States government wanted the records. In fact, I saw on Channel 13, or public television, about 10, 12 years ago, had a special on this. And there were Americans who had gone through this hell that petitioned their government to represent them to get reparations from the Japanese. And you know where it went? And one guy in particular says, I got sold out. Yeah, I think you did. But it shows you too that, yes, in some respects here, some of these people got a free pass because it was either we got the records or Moscow got them, depending on what it is they were looking for. Though some will get prosecuted, some of the Germans will be prosecuted at Nuremberg. Interesting time here. And a disgusting use here by the Nazis of capitalism, industrial revolution, technology for extermination purposes. And you know, fascinating here too, that in many respects, the Germans, give them credit, raised a hue and cry with T4. How much of that went on, though, with the final solution? No. Somebody just used the word selective. Yeah. Not a bad term for this. I think because of the fact not as much was well known about this, this program. And there's very few books written on it. In fact, I have one of the books written on this, and I have references to same in other books on Japanese atrocities in World War II. And it's quite a horrendous program. In fact, A gentleman who wrote a book on chemical and biological warfare devoted space to this too. Seagrave, I think his name was, and was it Yellow Rain? And he devoted a chapter to this in his book about the medical experiment. In other words, instead of using things like smallpox, in fact, the Russians were using botulism as a weapon. Yeah, yeah. In fact, it's thought. Keep in mind, after the North Vietnamese had defeated the South Vietnamese and united the country here, they will have a few border spats with China in the late 1970s, and Hanoi was really here a client of Moscow. And China and Vietnam have an antipathy going back many centuries. In fact, China on and off ran Vietnam, what you call Vietnam, for over 1,000 years. And the Vietnamese didn't want them back. And so there was some border incidents between China and China and Vietnam after the Vietnam War. And there was a report, supposedly the CIA did a report on this, that 1,200 Chinese troops were wiped out. And they were wiped out how? Biological or chemical weapons given to the North Vietnamese by the Soviets. Well, China has many more people than Vietnam, so how do you equal this? That's what we did with the Iraqis against the Iranians, because the Iranians outnumbered the Iraqis in a 3-to-1 with people. So how do you equal this? Use chemical weapons. You can kill a whole bunch at once, and that's what they did. Interesting here, these border disputes between China and Vietnam in the late 1970s. And now China's investing a lot in Vietnam. But yeah. And so when you're looking at medicine and then using diseases as weapons, that's a witch's brew. That is really a witch's brew. And so you see what man does, not only with his medicine, but taking diseases. In fact, going back to even ancient times, biological warfare was used. You take a diseased body and throw it down a well. So now your enemy can't use that water. Well, that's been going on for centuries. Or what the British did here in the 18th century in particular. As the white man is moving west, before we threw the British out of here. Like the Ohio River Valley is one place where, white man is trading with the Indian, like maybe blankets. You give them smallpox infected blankets because the Indian did not have a resistance to that disease yet. It's a European style disease. And so what happened with some of these Indian tribes? After they're dead, you move in and take the land. Why fight them? Yes. I mean, this country was going through various experiments too. And I think they were going to use flea-infested bats to plague the Japanese in World War II. Yeah, I mean, all these countries were trying to come up with some using Mother Nature's brew here, if you want to use that term, as a weapon. Yeah. But the other side of the coin here is too, when you go back to World War I, when the Germans began to use chemical weapons in World War I to break the trench warfare, using chlorine gas, then phosgene, which was more virulent than chlorine, and they attacked the lungs. Then they came out with, and the British and the French just follow suit. Then they came out with mustard gas. Now it's different. Mustard is what they call a vesicant. It sticks to the skin or your clothes, and it burns. And then, or if you breathe it in, it scalds your lungs, or if you get it in your eyes, you can go blind. And then in 1936, a Dr. Gerhard Schrader in Germany was working on a bug spray in December of 1936, and he became ill from the effects of what he was creating. He had to take 2-3 weeks off. He went back to work. And he realized what he had, and he has to, and it was a law in Germany. If you were a scientist, you came up with some new breakthrough, you had to report it to the military high command. They took a look at what he had, and boy, they lavished him with money, new lab, and he's off and running here. You know what he invented? Nerve gas, Tabin. And so now we've advanced here with regards to this. No longer are we attacking just the lungs. Now we're no longer attacking just the eyes. Nerve gas, you got a speck on your arm, unless you got an atropine needle. Guess what? Now it attacks the nervous system. And when you move your arm, right? The brain sends a message, right, to move your arm. Of course, this happens in milliseconds. And then if you want to cancel that message, you're thinking really fast here. You just draw your arm back, right? Well, the message is sent through by acetylcholine here, and then the message is canceled by another juice called cholinesterase. Well, the nerve gas attacks the cholinesterase. So if you're moving your arm out, it's not coming back. Or if you do this, now how do you exhale? You don't. I once saw a captured Nazi film of a dog infected with Tabin, and the dog, the gait gets wobbly, and I was watching this, and you could see, the close up, the eyes, they shrink to dots, and the dog just begins to keels over. And you can't stop this unless you got an atropine needle. And actually, by the time, in 1940, Dr. Schrader invented a more virulent form known as sarin. If you remember the sarin gas attacks down in the Tokyo subway tunnels, remember that one? Yeah. And then later on, when the war is almost over, they develop an even more virulent variety called Soman. But interesting here, when you look at this program, during the war, at a place called Dehernfurth in Poland, a factory here, they were producing nerve gas, thousands of tons of this stuff, and they'll never use it. The Nazis didn't produce an atomic bomb, but before we have the atomic bomb, they had their weapon of mass destruction, and they didn't use it. Interesting. They were putting this stuff in artillery shells, machine gun bullets, coming up with spray tanks, so on and so forth. And there were a number of people who died in this factory because they had been exposed to this. And guess who's going to get the factory? The Soviets. Now they're going to have it. But the Allies didn't know anything about this. And when the war was over and they found out, they were shocked. Absolutely shocked what they found. But the Nazis won't use it. And there's been various stories as to why. Some historians seem to think, well, Hitler himself had been gassed in World War I and thought this was terrible. Really? Then how come they were gassing people in the camps? I don't hold to that one. The one I would hold to is Amos Ambrose, who was Hitler's chemical warfare expert, and they were discussing this. Some of the wars turning against Germany, and some of his advisors are urging him to use this. And Amos Ambrose urged caution from the perspective that some of the chemicals that make up nerve gas, Ambrose says his intelligence people had found references to those same chemicals in Western chemical journals. So what is the idea? So what is the answer here? The Allies have it too? No, the Allies had no clue. So the Germans did have that weapon of mass destruction. They did, and if they had employed it at Normandy on D-Day, those Allied soldiers, they had defense maybe against phosgene, chlorine, and mustard, not against this because they didn't know it existed. It attacks the lungs. A lot good a respirator is going to do you, or a respirator from back then. They could have wiped out the beachhead or a lot of it. So, but they don't use it because, they're afraid, tit for tat here. If we use it, guess what? The Allies are going to use it. At the same time, the British were working on another weapon called the N-bomb, anthrax. Oh yeah, it gets better as you go along here. It gets better. And so when we talk about land-basting the United States for using the atomic bomb, let's understand what's going on in the larger picture here. Yeah. They were all working on stuff like this. It's not, to blame the United States for this. Like, come on, let's grow up. You're on the world scene. They're all going to do this. There are no angels here. Nobody is. It's who wins, who loses. And for the Nazis, this program, to win, you have to get rid of those weaklings in your society. There's no place for them. No place for them. Got to get rid of them. Whether it's their fault or not, get rid of them. Purge your society to make your society stronger. Even to the point of feeding your ladies porridge. Oh, that's a good question. How did we determine which scientists to take from Germany? Some of that was whoever got them first. Like Werner von Braun, yeah, you want him. I mean, if it wasn't for him, our space program might have been retarded here. I guess it comes down to who has value and who doesn't. Aircraft designers are in the same boat because the Germans were making swept-wing fighter planes. Well, maybe we want them too. We're going to follow suit here. And so are the Soviets. It's who can get them first. So yeah, people like von Braun, people like, yeah, you want them. And so we are going to give them a job. We're going to give them a way of life here. And they're going to, of course, Werner von Braun was interesting from the perspective, even in the 1930s, he was interested in sending somebody to the moon. And the Nazi government's telling him, hey, look, we're not interested in going to the moon. We want rockets to bomb other people, so that's what you're going to work on. But the basis of that forms what? Space program. So it did work from that perspective for us. But it's the value. What if they can do that for Germany, what happens when we throw more money at them here? And it worked. It worked. I can't really name them offhand, but there were a number of scientists that were at Peenemünde, where the Germans had their rocket program, which got to be a target, by the way, for Allied bombers. But some of them, that's why the Russians were able to be as successful as they were, because some of these scientists who didn't come here, they had no choice when the Soviets grabbed them. You're working for us. That's the end of it. And so that's going to help the Soviet program. I mean, both sides were using those V2s to start with. In fact, just as a side note, if you go back to certain movies in the 1950s, I'm talking about those sci-fi flicks, and you see them using actual footage of shooting rockets up, some of them are German V2s. One movie in particular, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Yeah, that was one of them. They're using their film footage of V2s as our rockets being shot up. So that was popular back then. But yeah, people like von Braun, yeah, you want them. And the Soviets are going to get German scientists from Peenemünde too, who couldn't escape to the West. And the Soviets aren't going to give them up, so give them a job, pay them, and they're working for you. So, same thing with some of the German officers. We did that with some of those officers that were fighting on the Russian front. We weren't there, but we want their expertise. It's the same thing there. So you're going to give some of these officers a new job, pay them, and they'll have a new life here. So interesting that side of the war itself, where some of these people who were fighting for the Nazis wound up. Well, some of your ex-Nazis government functionaries wound up in the new West German government. Got a new job. We gave them chemical weapons and the facilities to make same. Now, Iraqi generals, for the most part, didn't see chemical weapons as a weapon of mass destruction. They saw it as not just another weapon. And they will, in an effort to even that so-called advantage the Iranians had with regards to population. I mean, they outnumbered Iraq 3-1. And so they used chemical weapons. And it's right, in violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol. That's the Reagan administration. And so it doesn't make any difference what administration in the end, we just did it anyway, because we wanted to make sure Saddam stayed put. He didn't lose that war he started. And it's estimated, depending on what source you consult, upwards of 100,000 Iranians were gassed. And so they're going to, so when the Ayatollah came to power, and did not understand this, we helped start the nuclear program in Iran. We are the ones that helped start that program. And in 1957, when the Shah said he was going to start atomic energy research at Tehran University, in 1959, we sold them their first reactor, plutonium and uranium. And in 1968, they signed the NPT treaty for inspections. And then in the 1970s, the Shah said that the Shah wanted to have an array of nuclear power plants for the day, have them ready for the day that oil and gas ran out in Iran. By the early 1990s, he wanted to be able to produce 23,000 megawatts of electricity using atomic energy. Well, what happened to him in 1979? And the Ayatollah takes over, and the Ayatollah states that atomic energy is un-Islamic, and atomic weapons are an affront to God. Yet, after they got gassed, now some Iranians are beginning to think here. If we're going to face gas, then what's an equalizer to gas? The nuclear option here? Maybe that's something they share with Israelis. Jewish people were gassed. Okay, we got nuclear weapons. Who's going to mess with Israel now? You keep raising the ante here. Look at North Korea. Who wants to go there and fight now? Nobody. So yeah, when you look at sickness and disease, chemical weapons, you're to a certain extent, you're taking medicine here, like with disease, and you're transforming it into a weapon, is what you're doing here. That's exactly what you're doing here. It's a witch's brew. Anthrax, that's horrible, anthrax. I mean, that's got a 50 or 60% fatal rate. It's horrible. But, hey, that's what they do. So, a hell of a condemnation of mankind, huh? Yeah, it is. It is. For ruining your afternoon? Boy, you're a glutton for punishment, you are. Thank you very much. Thank you.